Hello, welcome to the Real Bit Wars. Today is the second episode of Chris's Corner. Well, I'm Chris, and this is my corner, and basically the concept is this. I'm one of those rare breeds of a retro gamer that loves sports titles. When I began collecting games, one of the first things I set out to do was acquire as many different sports titles as I could get my hands on. Basically, I was on a mission to determine which ones were the best and most worth my time. So over the years, I've accumulated quite a collection of these sports games. Now last time we covered football, and today we're going to go over the baseball games. So let's play ball! The first series that absolutely deserves to be mentioned is the RBI Baseball. Now this series covered many different platforms over several different years. Now the RBI series began as this more cutesy, sort of childish looking game, and over time it morphed into this much more realistic style of baseball game. Although in Japan they held on to that cute style much longer than they did here in North America. And not only that, Japan received many more installments in the series than we did. And it also received an installment on the Nintendo 64, which by the way is one of the better games in the entire series. Now baseball is actually really huge in Japan, and there are a ton of games that were released there that never found their way to North America. And for those of you that are importers, it's actually a really good way to bulk up your collection. Not only are the games really cheap and easy to find, but many of them are extremely playable and a lot of fun. Most notably is the Power Pro series from Konami. Now this series is rather unique in that it incorporates RPG elements into your typical baseball game. So not only is this game about what you do on the field, but a big part of it is what your character does off the field. From strength conditioning in the gym, to getting married and starting a family, attending college while you're on the university baseball team. It's actually a rather innovative series, and if you don't feel like importing it, some of the more recent titles have actually made their way into North America. Another decent game that bears a resemblance to the RBI series is Major League, which is a Japanese exclusive on the Famicom. However, does anyone else find it somewhat unusual that a licensed game based off an American movie about America's pastime, based on an American team, named after Native Americans, is a Japanese exclusive? Now before we move along, it's worth pointing out that many different sports games can be broken up into two separate subgenres. On the one hand, you have that more authentic, realistic approach. But then on the other hand, you have that over-the-top, crazy arcade style. Definitely my favorite of the latter category would be Super Baseball 2020 on the Sega Genesis. Developed by Electronic Arts, this game is done much in the vein of Base Wars on the NES. It features a very small home run area, whereas most balls actually bounce back into the field of play. Some of the players are actually women as well as cyborgs, which is actually really unique. And the field is littered with mines. Now this game was also ported to the Super Nintendo, but I must admit that this version just simply isn't as good. Although the Genesis version does feature a little bit of slowdown from time to time, it is vastly superior, and this one just isn't worth your time.
Just a bit outside.
Now before we move along, I need to bring up one of the seldom mentioned, yet very pivotal moments during the 16-bit era. You see, as Nintendo and Sega were duking it out for 16-bit supremacy, Nintendo actually was a majority owner of the Seattle Mariners. This may not seem like a big deal, but apart from upholding their reputation as a family-friendly business, this also assisted them in locking up exclusive rights with arguably the hottest player in the world at the time, Ken Griffey Jr. Now we all know about Sega's obsession with celebrity endorsements for their games, but I guarantee you it did not sit well with those at Sega that Nintendo could release a Ken Griffey Jr. game and they could not. But one really noteworthy thing about these games, well, maybe it's just easier to show you. This is what happens when you pop the cartridge in. Talk about a thrill house moment. Now that made the game seem absolutely epic. Can you imagine that? Being a kid at the store in the 90s, wondering, should I get this Ken Griffey Jr. game? Or maybe Sega has something to offer. Now as for the games themselves, starting on the Super Nintendo, also receiving installments on the Game Boy as well as the Game Boy Color, and moving on to the Nintendo 64, the games weren't bad. Now if you would like to learn more about this, pick up the book Console Wars by Blake J. Harris. It actually features plenty of information about the Seattle Mariners acquisition by Nintendo. But that's neither here nor there, and we're going on too long about it. So moving along. Now before we conclude, there's actually one more series that I have to talk about, and it might catch you by surprise. And I'm talking about the Bases Loaded games. Now overall, this series isn't really very noteworthy. There were 4 installments on the Nintendo. By the way, for you collectors, the 4th installment on the NES is actually extremely rare and hard to find. But the series continued on. There was a port to the Game Boy, which wasn't really very good. There was a game on the Saturn, which was terrible. But somewhere in between all of that, there were 3 installments on the Super Nintendo. The series peaked with the first game and trailed off with the 2 sequels. So, without a doubt, my favorite baseball game of all time is Super Bases Loaded on the Super Nintendo. Now you may recall earlier that I mentioned how some games aim for more of a realistic approach, and then others go for more of that arcade style. Well, there are some that land somewhere in the middle, and Super Bases Loaded is one of those games. So to go a little more in depth about the series, on the first NES installment, the fielding is a little bit too touchy. In the second one, the hitting is a little too touchy. The third one is just kind of slow and clunky. And in the fourth one, you can't move your player after fielding the ball. This is an issue that showed up time and time again and just plagued this entire series. On the second Super Nintendo installment, there was nothing to lock your batter in place. This could lead to accidental movement while swinging at pitches. Super Bases Loaded 3 was definitely the second best in the series, and for the first time it featured real teams as well as players. But once again, you can't move after fielding the ball. Bases Loaded 96 on the Sega Saturn, the graphics are just terrible. The batter looks awkward, the sprites look grainy and digitized, the field looks disproportionate while scanning. This one is without a doubt the worst in the series. And as for Bases Loaded on the Game Boy, all I can say is this is the type of game that makes you want to punch the programmer in the face. It's frustrating and just all around terrible. But these aspects only solidify the first Super Nintendo installment as my favorite. Unfortunately, tie goes to the runner does not apply, and it will result in some unnecessary outs. The variations in the pitch speed are somewhat unrealistic, meaning that sometimes the off speeds will be under 50 miles per hour and the fastballs can whiz right past you at about 110. Pitchers get fatigued if they are left in too long and will struggle with command and see a substantial drop in velocity. The pitchers can't hit very well, adding another element of realism to the game. You can, however, use a designated hitter to eliminate that problem. The game also has a point system. You receive points for good plays such as diving catches, and you are deducted points for things such as strikeouts.
Felt wrong not to swing.
This game also has the mercy rule, meaning that if you're leading by 9 or more runs at the end of any inning, the opposition is forced to forfeit and you automatically win. This is a really good pick up and play kind of game, meaning you just pop it in, you play 9 innings, you're done, and you move along with your life. And you just occasionally repeat that process. However, if you want to beat the game, that's where the challenge is really amped up, because with each game, the game becomes more and more difficult. However, you only have to win 4 consecutive times to beat the game. Another interesting thing about this game is it seems to feature this kind of sophisticated level of AI. Now, although when playing the computer, things like base running are extremely primitive and can be easily manipulated, other aspects are actually much more complex. Now, much like real life, sometimes a certain player or team will struggle against another. Sometimes the game will be an absolute slugfest, and other times you'll narrowly avoid defeat in a pitcher's duel. Well, that does it for this episode of Chris's Corner here on The Real Bit Wars. Stay tuned in the future because I'll be covering other sports as well. Thank you for watching, and don't forget...
There's no crying in baseball!
Yeah, what he said.
Just a bit outside.